Finally, I want to take a look at what actually happens behind the scenes whenever you build and ultimately run, but particularly whenever you build your source code. And so we kind of mentioned some of this in the previous video. First of all, the build step will check for errors to make sure your syntax is correct. Then it will convert your code into another language called the intermediate language. And then it will actually, the first time it runs, it'll compile it into a assembly or a DLL. Specific to your particular operating system and so on. And so the assembly is launched and hosted then by the .NET Core runtime from that point on. But let's take a look at our file structure. At this point, I want to do a directory inside of the Hello World. And you'll notice that there's a new folder called bin. And bin is short for binary, which is kind of a convention for programmer types to look there for the actual compiled version of the code. So if we do a CD into the bin directory, you can see that there is a debug folder. There will ultimately be a release folder once we get ready to compile our application for release. The debug version will contain extra information that will allow us to use a visual debugger, like one you can find in Visual Studio Code or the full Visual Studio IDE. We'll show you that later. Don't worry. This isn't meant to be, it just has extra files in it and extra information that won't be necessary whenever you actually want to deploy this for realsies out to another machine. All right, so let's change into that debug directory. So cd debug and then do a directory there. Now it's going to show you the debug version for this specific version of .NET. So you could target multiple .NET Core versions. In this particular case, we want to cd into .NET Core app 3.1 and then do a directory. And here you can see there's a bunch of information, all prefixed with the word hello world. There's runtime config.dev.json, runtime config.json. There's a PDB file, an exe file, a DLL file, and another deps.json. All right, a lot of things, but ultimately all we really are interested in is in the exe and the DLL. The exe is kind of the bootstrap. The DLL actually has our code. So to run this, all we need to do at this point is type in hello-world, and it will execute our file. So we don't need to do .NET space run. It's been compiled. We can run the last compiled version that's stored here by just calling it by its executable name. All right. And that's all I really wanted you to know, is just what happens behind the scenes the very first time you build the application. What files is it creating? What are those all for? And yeah, I think you have a pretty good fundamental understanding now of the system. Every time you go to build the application again, it will just overwrite these files with the latest version, and that's it. Nothing mysterious. It's just writing files to very specific places on your hard drive, okay? So now you're ready to move on, at least learn a little bit about Visual Studio Code, and then we'll start writing some C#.